Hey there, today we are doing chapter 6, which is called The Core Issues, Abandonment and Loss. So, Nancy Newton Verrier starts off with a quote from from Harriet Matchiger. One of the most common fears is that of being abandoned. Abandonment is a dominant theme in child myths. And then she goes on to quote John Bowlby. Loss of a loved person is one of the most intensely painful experiences any human being can suffer, and not only to witness it only because we are so impotent to help. To the bereaved, nothing but the return of the lost person can bring true comfort. Should what we provide fall short of what is felt, almost as an insult, there is a tendency to underestimate how intensely distressing and disabling loss usually is, and for how long the distress can often the disablement commonly lasts. Conversely, there is a tendency to suppose that a normal healthy person can and should get over a bereavement not only fairly rapidly but also completely. So yeah, there is a lot of, I think a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding when it comes to grieving and loss. Um, and here's some of the things that I say. This is somewhat adoption related when I talk about my experience on this, because I'm not directly talking about my birth parents on this, but I've lost loved ones, aunts, uncles, grandparents. Um, and one of it's kind of hard to describe. I lost one of my aunts, my aunt Kate, back in 2012, 2000. I want to say it was 2012 or 2011. I can't even remember what year it was, but so it's been a while, right? It's definitely been at least a decade at this point. And obviously, I still remember her. I still remember, the fun times we had together. I remember all the good food she used to make. I remember baking with her. She taught me a little bit. I remember the dog Puddin'. I always called Puddin' mine because every time I went to be with her, visit her, whatever, Puddin' would be in my custody. I remember she babysat me with Puddin', and we used to watch Scooby Doo together. Like, it was just fun times. We used to take Puddin' to the beach. All great memories, right? And yes, on occasion I cry about it. But you see that I can now remember back on the good times without being triggered, right? I wouldn't say trigger is the right word for it, but I'm not getting overly emotional. I can appreciate all those good times. And the same thing would be said for my grandparents. And it takes time, you know? It's not a right away, and it will differ on the people, on the person who's grieving, and that's okay. I always say, take your time when you grieve because not everyone will be the same in how they process it and how long. And now, I shouldn't say now, but like I've always, for her specifically, one of my favorite meals that I have every year for my birthday, it is tradition. I make some of her favorite recipes. Um, and when we do it, we honor her. You know, it's not, it's the recipe that honors her. Um, but like we think about it. We also go to Maine every year. That's where she lived. Um, and whenever I'm out there, I think about her. We talk about it. You know, I wouldn't say we all go visit where she used to live. But we'll pass by it and we'll be like, oh yeah, like remember those times. And there's just some other things about it. Whereas with my grandma, um, so Grandma Mary is technically my full grandma from my mom's side, right? I don't have that many memories of her. I do have a lot of pictures, and I don't like, there's only one memory I truly have of her. I don't know how old I was, but we were going through, I thought it was Disneyland, but apparently it was Macy's. It was one of the Macy's Santaland things. And I just remember her being there for one of those. But that's all I really have. Whereas with my grandma Fran, who's actually my great aunt, that's confusing. So it's Mary's sister, Fran, but I always just called her grandma after my grandma actually died. She was more of a grandma to me anyway. Um, and like I have memories going out to Kentucky to be with grandma. I have memories of her cooking salmon and strawberry rhubarb. I have memories of, we went shopping and we worked on our family tree and we had all these celebrations with all the cousins and we were laughing. Now, granted, I was older, but it's just a different grief, right? And she died back in 2017. Like, that was hard. I truly wish that we had made that trip back out to Kentucky so I could say my final goodbyes. Um, and that hurts. That does hurt. I will just say that. With my grandpa, so Fran's husband, he died in, I want to say it was 2008. Was it 2008? No, it wasn't 2008. 2006? I think it was 2006. And again, we didn't go out there. It was like fairly sudden, but I don't have that many memories of him. Like, he was just around, great person, loved him, but I don't have any one-on-one memories with him. But you guys get the point. Like, it's just gonna differ for everyone, and that's okay. Whereas with our birth family, for a lot of us, our parents are still around, right? Not everyone, obviously, and it's different. But for me, both of them are still alive as far as I know. And it's a different grief process because you don't get to be around them. Sometimes it's good, depends on the adoptee, but you still know that they're around. When they're not around, when they're, gone, it hits you like a ton of bricks. And this is where I'm struggling. Like, my birth mom's not in good health. Who knows how much longer she's gonna last. Um, Part of me doesn't want to go out there, and part of me is like, that might be the only chance I ever get of meeting her in person, besides talking online. Um, and so it's very difficult for me. Okay, sorry, long story. That was quite a long story for you guys. So let's get into this chapter. Anyway, she starts off. The author starts off the profoundness of loss. If the primal experience for the adopted child is abandonment, then the core issues are loss and the fear of further abandonment. Neither is acknowledged in most adoptive families, since the abandonment occurred so early in the child's life, aka like within the child's first 3 years of life. Most adoptions in the United States are privately adopted. There's about 200,000 through privatized, and there's about 65,000 through foster care. But yeah, that's a lot. Given no acknowledgement of their loss or tools to help them grieve, the child copes in whatever way they can, ways which manifest in behavior that is often misunderstood. Loss itself is not very well understood in our society. We tend to deny its importance on many levels. We get married and celebrate the joy of the new phase of life without ever considering that there may be a loss involved, much less that we might need to mourn that loss. Or a couple has a baby and send out the happy announcements, while neither dares think about the loss of a different kind of relationship, what impact a new family member will have on them, and that grieving might be in order. There is no permission in our society to recognize each other's life transitions, the polarities between gain and loss, or joy and sorrow. We are expected to be happy, sing songs, dance shakes, and never to mourn. So I want to pause here for a second. I, I know I'm not getting much reading done right now, but this is exactly it. So already in society, we kind of like expect people to move on quickly. And with hopeful adoptive parents, they're like, I want a baby, I'm super excited. And as adoptees, we're like, I don't think you understand the concept. You're being joyful about ripping a family apart. They essentially are, right? Even if it's a necessity, that's still something that's really sad for the adoptee, and they focus on themselves, right? And then as adoptees, especially as we're older, we're like, hey, like we grieve and loss, and we need people to understand that. They just automatically will be like, the comments are, well, you should be grateful, or you should be happy you weren't in that home, or these nasty comments, and it really hurts. It really does. They don't understand, and they won't have empathy for us. Now, granted, I will say this. If a child lost a family member, a parent, whether it was to war, a car accident, or a great illness, they will have empathy for that child. But God forbid that child is adopted or part of foster care, they won't. It's ridiculous. Anyway, sorry, I ranted on that. Anyway, just as we have a few rituals or rites of passage in our society to help us through transition periods, neither do we value the more negative aspects of those periods. We are a society in which we want everything to be nice or positive, and one which we try to ignore or get through as soon as possible. Everything that is painful or difficult, we have a great deal of difficulty accepting, understanding, or even acknowledging that it may be a paradox and polarity that give life energy and excitement. The impetus toward movement, the aspiration towards change and growth. If we do not recognize that someone has suffered a loss, one that we cannot ignore, such as a death of a parent, spouse, or child, we can tolerate the bereaved person's grief for so long, and then we expect them to get on with their life. As Bowlby puts it, there is a tendency to suppose that a normal, healthy person can and should get over a bereavement not only fairly rapidly but also completely. So, with little permission to fully acknowledge or mourn our losses, we deny them. We send them down into the depths of the unconscious where they rule our lives in many insidious ways, causing feelings and behavior which are then sometimes labeled as pathological. The wow, I cannot say this word. Pathologizing of abandonment and loss. Ooh, that is a handful of a word sometimes. Yet, it is possible to completely recover from a devastating loss. Oh, is it possible? Such as a child's loss of their mother or a mother's loss of their child. What is meant by pathological response to loss? We seem to be a nation of depressed people. Are we all, in some sense, pathological? Depression may be a sign of unresolved grief. If we gave permission and had the results of grieving our myriad and varied losses in life, would we be more healthy people or happier people? Would we then be able to function better in our society? That's a really good question. I'd like to hear what your thoughts are. I think it would, I don't know, I think it would help in many ways, but I think there needs to be a lot of change between systems, not just the societal point of view, but like the way that our government handles certain things like adoption, like foster care, like the prison system, like schooling. There's just all these other things that need to change for us, I think, overall to be happier people. But those are just my 2 cents. Let me know down below what yours are. Anyway, moving on. And what about anxiety? Perhaps the anxiety left by so many people signals a greater incidence of childhood trauma than we would like to admit. In addition to the now recognized trauma of child child physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, I propose to add the trauma of the separation of a child from its mother. It is difficult to change our thinking about adoption from that of a wonderful, altruistic event to that of a traumatic, terrifying experience for the child. It is difficult, and understandably so, for the adoptive parents to look at the infant and think that they might be suffering. Yet how can he not be, or they not be? Except in the case of some truly enlightened adoptive parents, there is no acknowledgment of the child's loss to the original mother. Therefore, there is no permission, either implicit or explicit, to mourn. Okay, I want to pause there because I was just kind of talking about this where I have adoptive parents who they did everything that adoptees would want to do, right? This is what we, if adoption still had to happen, and I'm talking from the adoptive parent point of view, not the legal aspect, because legally there needs to be changes, but if there was training for adoptive parents, my parents did everything that should have been done. And yet I still feel like I'm mourning, I'm 30 now, and I'm still mourning the relationships that could never happen. And it brings up a lot of complex emotions. And they allow me to feel, they don't demand anything of me. Um, they don't demand gratefulness. They don't demand that I like, oh, you shouldn't mourn this, that. They listen to me, and yet it's still a very long, I don't know, it's just different. Like, I'm trying to explain to you guys, it's different. When I look back on those memories of my lost loved ones through death, I I wouldn't say I'm completely over it, but I can look back on those memories and be like, yeah, we did this and that, and like, all those happy memories. Whereas when I look upon basically the death of the relationship with my birth mother or birth father, which, complex, but there's no happy memories. There's nothing to look back on because it wasn't able to exist, if that makes sense. Now, yeah, I had an open adoption. I have letters from my birth mom till I was 8, and like we talk now, but it's still, there's no birthdays, there's no Christmases. I don't remember. There's nothing. No, she wasn't here in person. I will just, if you're asking, she wasn't. Um, but that's it's the death of a relationship without the death of a person, and that's very, very hard to deal with. Um, in a different aspect than if it was like the death of, like if you broke up with your partner, say, and you had to move on. It's not even the same thing because you still had those memories with your partner. So it's hard to explain, but it's something that wasn't there that we have to mourn because it should have been there. I hope that makes sense. Anyway, as the adoptee matures, the grief goes on, unresolved. Depression and anxiety persist, yet because most adopted children are placed with the adoptive parents as infants, clinicians fail to consider trauma and unresolved grief as the causes of their anxiety and depression, thereby missing an opportunity for an effective treatment. There is no doubt that the grieving person needs help. When one has suffered a loss at the beginning of their life, before conscious memory, there is a need to work through the loss in order for the person to function well later in life, both personally and professionally. If we think of unresolved grief as pathological, we should do so only in the sense that it hinders efficiency. The adoptee's emotional reactions to past events are normal and need to be validated. At the same time, they must be seen as maladaptive in the present and a hindrance to full functioning. Precious energy gets diverted in many ways. First is the need to starve off another rejection and loss. Later, as the child begins to sense on a more conscious level that they are different from those who are nurturing them. Energy is diverted to the tremendous effort it takes to quote unquote fit in with the adoptive family. Or there may be even more basic need to prove that they have a right to exist in the world. Depression as a result of unresolved grief and anxiety caused by a long functioning trauma and concomitant sense of impending doom, another abandonment, work in tandem and often restrict the full functioning of an adoptee's emotional and intellectual capacities. George described it like trying to walk underwater. There is so much resistance. If I could rid myself of anxiety, everything would be so easy. Other adoptees talk about an underlying sadness which seems constant and pervasive, a hindrance of real joy. Anna Marie puts it this way: even when I'm having fun, there is a shadow inside me, something which keeps me from experiencing joy or what I think joy might be. Yeah, I agree to both of those. Okay, post-traumatic stress disorder. If depression and anxiety are twin symptoms for adoptees, the closest diagnosis might best be described as post-traumatic stress disorder, aka PTSD. Because the earlier source of symptoms are often overlooked, however, the diagnosis is not often recognized. An adoptee may demonstrate the telltale signs of anxiety or fear, helplessness, loss of control, threat of annihilation. Yet, unless there is evidence of child abuse, they are not seen as having suffered trauma. Yeah, a lot of people ignore that adoption as in itself is a traumatic event and that there are trauma responses to it, and even adoptees, like there are a lot that are again in the fog, who can't even recognize that, right? This is a medically known thing, but the trauma responses are not often known, and I think that needs to be spread. There needs to be a lot more information about that because, whew, there is quite a lot on that. There are other signs of trauma: intrusion, a traumatic memory of the first abandonment, and constriction, a shutting down or surrendering to the situation at hand. Being in the wrong family is an example. I was referring to the intrusion when I talked about suicidal ideation for the adoptee and the meaning this might have. Intrusion makes them alert to a possible repetition of past trauma, or a feeling that one needs to facilitate it. The threat of annihilation or the urge to make concrete an experience they thought they might have had but can't remember. Dying. Even if the present environment is safe, it may not feel that way. Traumatic memories in the form of emotional or bodily sensations keep intruding into consciousness. This often causes the adoptee to appear irritable, aggressive, impulsive, and antisocial. Yeah. In the case of constriction or numbing, the adoptee is in another state of consciousness where they can't be hurt by painful memories. The state is characterized by emotional detachment, indifference, complacency, and passivity. This is the state adoptees are in when everyone thinks they are daydreaming. It is almost as if they are in a trance. Teachers complain about the state in school children. Schoolwork is difficult because it often involves memory, something the adoptee is trying to keep at bay. Adoptees vacillate between intrusion and constriction, with one or the other being the normal way of operating in the world, and the other insinuating itself into their behavior from time to time. This leaves them feeling paralyzed, unable to integrate the trauma and to get on with life. There is an existential dilemma whereby they are unable to make sense of either natural or divine order. Mothers are not supposed to leave their babies. God should not let it happen. No rationalizations changes that basic knowing. So, while I wouldn't say it's a religious thing, but it's very a societal thing, that it's not natural for a mother to leave their baby, even in the wild, right? That's not very common. Um, but it does happen. Now, usually in the wild, the baby will either die, unfortunately, because that does happen, or will be adopted by a fellow species member. So, like an elephant will be adopted by another elephant member, as an example. On occasion, it could be an interspecies, but that's more. I've not seen it so much in the wild as in like rehabilitation centers. At least from the stories I've seen. You know, the Jungle Book. That's not like a usual thing, right? It's not like a bear and was it a wolf usually taking a child to raise as their own. That's not true. Um, but with the way that society is, it's we see it as, well, the mother couldn't take care of you. See, the birth mom that gets it from all sides. It's like the mother couldn't take care of you, so they try to give you the best chance by giving you to who they think is a loving family to help you. Obviously, there's no guarantees that they're a loving family, but that is something that is happening. Then society tells the child, well, your mother didn't love you enough to keep you. Or often, especially here in America, especially in privatized adoption and the foster care system, there's a lot of coercion, a lot of it, and it's wrong. But yeah, it's not really so much a religious thing, it's just more of a societal, natural thing. Like other victims of trauma, adoptees often turn their rage at the unspeakable thing that happened to them on their caretakers. Although some reunited adoptees speak of feeling rage for their birth mothers or for the society which caused their separation from her, many will say that they feel no ill will toward her, but have all their lives exhibited personal behavior or intense rage towards their adoptive parents. Paradoxically, they feel a tremendous dependency upon and need to connect to those same adoptive parents. This ambivalence is the source of great confusion and enigmatic, I can't say this word right now. Enigmatic behavior. I feel that. Yeah, you know, I used to be mad at her, at my birth mom. I know I was. And according to my APs, there was a time where I hated her and wanted everything to do with her gone. From, our house, because my parents kept a lot of things. But I don't even remember doing that as a kid. And apparently I went through therapy probably around the same time. I don't remember any of that. Like, I think about it now that they tell me, and I'm like, I clearly blocked that out. That's a trauma response, by the way, blocking out memories. But now that I'm older, am I still hurt by some things that she did? Absolutely. Absolutely. I am. But I'm not like overly mad at her. It's about specific things that she could have or should have changed. But it's not gonna, like, it's hard to describe. I'm upset in some ways. I'm understanding in some ways, but I also know that I can't change the past. but I also don't feel like I'm nearly as close with my adoptive parents as I should be. And sometimes that hurts. Anyway, sorry guys, moving on. Not understanding the unconscious source of this behavior, parents think that their children should be able to change it at will. There's often a feeling that if the child would just shape up, just try harder, they would be able to do better in relating to the adoptive parents, in making and keeping the right kinds of friends, and in their schoolwork. Yeah, in talking to adult adoptees who did act out as children or adolescents, they of course don't understand it any more than their parents do. Michael told me, I put my parents through hell, and I don't know why. They were good parents. They did their best and always stuck by me. But I was always mad at them, feeling manipulated by them, and striking out at them. I couldn't seem to help it. It was coming from a dark part of me that I had no control over. I feel terrible about it, and yet I am still not able to have a loving relationship with them, and I just don't know why. The idea that he was reacting to a trauma that he didn't even remember had never even occurred to him. He just thought he was the bad kid. Ooh, the bad versus good. We're going to talk about that right now, actually. Here we go. When treatment is sought, it is usually only for the bad kid, the aging out child. The good kid, as constricted and shut down as may be, is not seen as having any problems. One reason that the difficult child is sent into treatment is that the parents can no longer cope with their behavior, and with good reason. The provocation and aggression caused by anxiety about a further rejection becomes more and more destructive and unbearable to the parents as the child tests their commitment to them. The provocative behavior often plays into parents' insecurities about being good enough parents into their own rejection issues. They often become defensive and retaliatory instead of understanding and steadfast. Sadly, their defensive reactions often produce the very outcome which the adoptee feared in the first place: abandonment, being sent out of the home to residential treatment centers, boarding schools, or simply out on the streets. If the adoptee's behaviors were seen as attempts to avoid pain rather than deliberate provocation of the parents might be able to identify the signs or manifestations of that trauma and help the child integrate it. Yes, everything I wanted to say right there. And this often gets the child rehomed. Yeah, rehoming adoptive children is very common. In fact, I don't remember the statistics on it. I will read it in the next book, which will be Chosen Children 2021 by Lori Carangelo. In one of the chapters, she does go on about the statistics of this, but often children who are adopted are rehomed more than once. Yeah, how horrible is that? Now, obviously, I was not. I'm very lucky in that, but that is a thing. Or, as this just stated, a lot of adoptees often get put into residential homes, boarding schools, or they get kicked out. And adoptees who are LGBTQ are at a higher rate of that. And it's really, really sad. It's terrible. And if you were to call CPS for the help when abuse is happening, or when things are happening so that they could get more treatment, CPS completely ignores it. Because the child is adopted already, they don't care. And that is so harmful. So incredibly harmful. But again, this is something that I'll cover in the next book that I plan on posting. Alright, Moving on, the manifestations of separation and loss in childhood. What are the ways in which one can detect the wounds of abandonment and loss in children? In addition to those criteria already mentioned, the stages of grief through which an infant passes, somatic responses to loss, separation anxiety upon entering daycare or school or going away to camp, the sabotaging of birthday parties, ooh, that's a big one for adoptees, and other anniversary reactions, and the loss of self. There are some other responses which I want to mention, some upon which I would like to expand. One of those is the numbing of affect or feelings. And so that's what we're about to talk about. The numbing of affect. One of the ways in which parents can detect a problem with loss in a compliant child is the way in which they respond to death or separation. What happens when a pet dies? How do they react when a grandparent is buried? What is their reaction to overnight separations or visits to relatives without the parents? When our two daughters would visit their grandparents for a few days, it was my older adopted daughter who would call after the first day and say that she thought she'd better come back home. This always surprised me, not because she loved her grandparents, but because she seemed to have such a difficult time relating to me. I thought she'd relish a break from our confrontations. What I didn't understand was that the anxiety which produced both oppositional behavior and the fear of being away from me had the same root cause, the fear of abandonment. Loss can cause a complete change in behavioral patterns. Bella, who was quite close to her father, didn't mourn him very much when he died. Although when she was 13 years old at the time, she always wondered about this. What did happen that she just suffered a dramatic behavioral change, going from provocative and aggressive to quiet, withdrawn, and compliant. She decided to be good and be perfect at everything. Her grades improved dramatically. She became totally withdrawn because being otherwise wasn't worth the risk anymore, and she wasn't sure what the risk was, but it was possible that it was the loss of another parent about which she would feel responsible. Despite losses, she managed to keep functioning by a conscious effort. When she began to feel too much, she cut off her feelings. She allowed herself to get angry, but not hurt. After years of therapy, she is now allowing herself to feel sadness. Anger is often a defense against sorrow. Mothers who have said that they have never had any trouble with their children will nevertheless admit that children do not show much emotion in the face of loss, because the loss of a grandparent or a beloved pet can trigger memories of the first lost. Children often numbed by this and express very little, if any, affect. Their feelings go underground. They numb out. This is often interpreted by the parents or others as the child's being callous or unfeeling, when they are actually warding off devastation. To feel this devastation, to re-experience the original loss, is too painful. So the child denies the impact of the loss as a defense against psychological deterioration. When my daughter was 10, my father died unexpectedly. They had shared a very close relationship, and I knew that she was devastated by the death of her grandfather. She did cry and talk about it somewhat, but the most notable response was that of resignation and heightened vigilance, as if she knew that closeness meant inevitable loss and subsequent need to defend against it happening again. She even said, "You see, Mom, I told you it was easier not to love in the first place." I replied, "Yes, love is a risk, because we can never be sure that the person we love will be around forever. But isn't it better that you had those 10 years of love and closeness to Grandpa than to have missed them? If it gave you and Grandpa both something special that without the risk you would have missed, and I know it is important to both of you." Although she listened intently. I'm not sure that she was convinced. As an adult, she can now look back on her relationship with her grandfather with fond memories. But for a long time, the loss, the reopening of the wound, seemed almost unbearable. Okay. Moving on to if you leave, you're out. Another manifestation of the trauma of abandonment is that being unable or unwilling to allow anyone who is perceived to have abandoned the adoptee back into their life. Ginger says that she is stoic in the face of loss, that she never knows about the real feeling, what the real feeling is. She doesn't cry. Tears of sadness don't come out, and anger is a flash in the pan. If people leave her, she will not allow them back into her life. I tend to say, fine. If someone separates from me and leaves me, that's it. I shut the door on the person and I don't let them back in. It's like, I dare you, you leave and that's it. It doesn't seem to matter that the person could not have avoided the separation. Jennifer's best friend, Alice, left for Europe when her father was transferred, and Jennifer was inconsolable for days. She said that it was more than losing her best friend. It was like losing part of herself. Yet when Alice returned 2 weeks later, Jennifer wasn't able to allow her into her life in the same way. She rationalized about it at the time, but she knows it was really that she could not trust that Alice would not leave again. She could only allow the vulnerability which she had allowed herself in the first place. She had not since been so attached to a girl or a woman friend. Hannah had a similar experience and said that she was able to tolerate the deaths of her grandparents all right, but she cannot tolerate the end of relationships. Joanne said that she cut off feelings of loss when her father died. In relationships, even short-term relationships, she has a difficulty adjusting to separation or to being alone. Fears of abandonment are not fantasies. Therapists write about the fantasies related to abandonment, which cause adopted children to cling to adoptive parents or fantasize about a reunion with the birth mother. There's often a discounting of the importance of those fantasies, or an implication that they are irrational. It should be noted that although the fear of being abandoned by the adoptive parents might be fantasy, there is a precedent for that fear in the original abandonment experience, which may be felt unconsciously. The fear, therefore, should not be perceived as irrational. One learns from experience, after all, and adoptees have experienced abandonment. So, as I mentioned earlier, adoptees are also at a higher rate of being rehomed. So it's not just one abandonment, it's multiple. Especially in foster care kids too. They go through the same stuff. It's one home after another. And it's really, really sad and gross, and we have a lot of problems in our society with this. Alright. Abandonment to any child is the greatest fear of all. There is nothing that can shape up a child so fast as a threat to send him back where he came from, or to see how he likes living someplace else. Even children who are abused by their parents have a deep sense of loyalty toward them, and a fear of being separated from them. In myth and fairy tale, the theme of abandonment is dominant. Is it not possible that the fear hangings will, like the sword of Damocles, over the heads of all adoptees all their lives, but about which they might be consciously that they might not be consciously aware? I believe that it is possible that it is the unconscious fear which causes anxiety experienced by so many adoptees. Although the adoptee might not be consciously aware of the fear of abandonment, which is then felt as free-floating anxiety, there is an attitude which can be readily discerned. It is the kind of watchfulness or cautious testing of the environment which is called hypervigilance. As an infant stage, hypervigilance can be noticed by very observant nurses, social workers, or adoptive parents, and is often described as awareness, alertness, or being a live one. It may be. However, as I described earlier, an anxious response to abandonment, and one in which a relinquished child hopes to avoid a repeat of the abandonment experience. Okay, stealing and hoarding. Another behavior which manifests in adopted children is stealing or hoarding. The child may steal or take money or food in a seemingly irrational concern about there not being enough food. The precedent forming experience has been that the feeder disappeared, resulting in a pervasive fear that they may have someday have to be on their own and be better prepared. The people from whom the child steals are those they like or respect the most, their parents, siblings, teachers, or best friends. Some adoptees, reflecting upon this as adults, say that part of this is a feeling that they themselves had been stolen, which is easier to accept than the fact that their mothers have given them away. Well, I think it's a mix. Sometimes it's a mix. But anyway, and that therefore stealing might be alright. It is a legitimate way to get what one feels one needs, and there is a tremendous reluctance to return that which was stolen, which is connected to the fear of being rejected or returned by the adoptive parents. If I have to return the money, my parents might have to return me. If the parents can acknowledge this fear is a way of expressing an earlier experience and yet let the child know that the behavior cannot be tolerated, the anxiety level may be lowered and the need to hoard and steal diminished. Children need to know that they are understood and they need help in understanding their own feelings and behavior. Control as a foil to loss. One of the ways in which children and adults too try to prevent future losses is to try to be in absolute control of every situation. I mentioned in the preface that at times my daughter needed to be in control seemed like a matter of life and death. Nothing I suggested, from what food to eat to which clothes to wear, was ever right. And yet she could never really make up her own mind. Getting ready to go anywhere became a nightmare. I hear similar stories from many, many adoptive parents. The simplest household decision or suggested deviation from routine becomes an immense struggle for control. It isn't just a matter of opinions or taste, it's a matter of survival. The child was not in control of the situation at the beginning of their life. And look what happened. It becomes intolerable to those children ever again to allow someone else to be in control of their lives. They fight it at every turn. These struggles can be won by neither parent nor child. Because if the parent gives up and allows the child to decide for themselves, the issue then becomes, you never help me, or you don't really care. Parents often feel they are on a catch-22 situation. Yeah, I've definitely done both. I've definitely done both. Still do sometimes. The battle for control appears to the parents like obstinacy, which technically it is, but it emanates from a tremendous fear on the part of the child of another abandonment. That which looks to parents like hatred, rejection, or insolence has at the root of it an enormous dependency and need for acceptance, yet a lack of trust in those upon whom the child is supposed to depend. If the parent's need for acceptance rivals that of the child's, problems become almost intolerable for everyone concerned. In the last part of the book, I will talk about ways of diffusing the inevitable fireworks which result from the issue of control. For adoptees, the need to defend themselves against the possibility of abandonment or other losses intrudes into almost every relationship, beginning that of the adoptive mother and including relationships to friends, lovers, and even themselves. All right, and here's the summary. Our failure to acknowledge the devastation of separation from the birth mother on adopted children extends into many other areas of our society, where we routinely ignore or deny the impact of loss. Unresolved grief over some long forgotten or represented loss may be at the root of much of that which is considered clinical depression in our society. While it is true that many grieving people need help, this help is not so much in the form of getting them through it quickly as it is in giving them permission to feel their loss and the time means to process it. Most of these people are not sick or abnormal. They are people who are suffering a result society's ignorance and its use of denial as a major defense against pain and paradox. Although blaming the victim is often phenomenon of trauma, like rape victims and battered women, for instance, being separated from their birth mothers and handed over to strangers in the adoption process is the only trauma where the victims are expected by the whole of society to be grateful. They are not grateful, they are grieving, and the original abandonment and loss are the sources of many other issues for the adoptee. Yeah, yep. All right. Stay tuned for chapter 7 for tomorrow. I hope you all enjoyed that. That hit home big time.